Neil Rutherford is a name you might not know, but he will forever be remembered by natives of a small coastal town as the perpetrator of the most hideous mass murder in the history of North Wales. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. Linda, Lorna, Alistair and Johnny. Penmaen Mawr is a small North Wales coastal town that only has about 3,000 people living in it. The town has a long history of quarrying, and in recent years it's been a popular place to go on holiday. By the 1970s, quarrying was declining, but it was still important to the town. In the dry, warm summer months, there was nothing better than a gentle walk along the seashore path or a stroll along the Edwardian period promenade down to the seafront. By the 1970s, the main road through Penmaen Mawr was becoming clogged with tourist traffic, quarry wagons and lorries going into the ferry port, but it was still just a sleepy holiday destination where nothing much happened from one year to the next. The residents of the town lived their lives quietly and without fuss. That is until the 25th of July 1976, when everything changed. Neil Rutherford was not from Penmaen Mawr, but he fell in love with it and chose it as his home. Neil was described as short, stocky, and probably someone who just wouldn't be noticed in a crowd of people. He had a colourful past, and by 1976 he was 54 years old and he had once been part of the Navy. In 1948 Neil got married, and then 11 years later, after the death of his dad, he slightly shifted his goals and he decided to take over the family's shipbuilding company. Unfortunately, that didn't last long, and the company dissolved a few years later, as did his marriage. After that, Neil started working at the Red Gables Hotel. He worked at the Red Gables Hotel in Penmaen Mawr, first as a gardener and also as a handyman. Neil was known locally as the Commander. He was quite a lonely man, he kept himself to himself, and he was very quiet. He loved gardening though, and he particularly loved growing tomatoes, which he'd give away to his local neighbours and people that he saw out and about. He really liked to drink, and he would go to his local pub, the Alexandra, every single day, and he'd sit in the corner and just have a drink to himself. He always drank alone, and he rarely would start a conversation, and if someone tried to engage him in a conversation, he would usually give them a 1 or 2 word answer and then go on his way. He was known in most of the pubs in Penmaen Mawr, and one of the pub landlords described him as a very fidgety man. Quote, "He would never sit down. He used to pace up and down the room and look out of the window. He would just have half a pint of Guinness and then go. He never stayed longer than half an hour." Red Gables was a 3-storey hotel, and it was set a little way back from the road. Altogether it housed 12 bedrooms for guests, but it was rarely full. The hotel itself was run by 59-year-old Lisa Simcox and her daughter Lorna McIntyre, who was 24. Lorna and her husband Alistair McIntyre were expecting their first baby. On Friday the 25th of July, the only guest staying at the hotel was one of the friends of the people who owned it. It was an ex-merchant seaman named Johnny Green. He was 55 years old, and he was an antiques dealer from Texas. Local people didn't really know the McIntyres. They'd moved to the area around 5 years earlier, and they sort of kept themselves to themselves. They were really focused on trying to build the hotel. Neil had worked for the McIntyres for 18 months before suddenly leaving. We don't know if he was fired or if he just left of his own accord. It's not clear, but what is clear is that he left very suddenly. On that Friday, Neil was in the local Mountain View hotel having a drink, and the landlord noted that he seemed his normal self. He was pacing up and down the pub as normal, and he had his usual Guinness, but this time he topped it up with a couple of gins. Neil then left the Mountain View hotel and made his way over to Red Gables. He had a pistol in his pocket, and it wasn't his service pistol, it was one he must have obtained some other way, possibly with the premeditated intention of what he was about to do at Red Gables. As he approached the hotel, Lorna was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, and the only guest that day, Johnny Green, was in the kitchen area in the basement. Linda and Alistair were in one of the lounges on the first floor near the reception, and so Neil walked calmly into the first floor area. He could hear Linda and Alistair talking, and he walked through calmly and faced them. It's unlikely Neil greeted them back. Instead, he saw this as a military operation. He raised his pistol, pointed it at Linda and shot her with pinpoint accuracy, killing her immediately. Blood spattered onto the floor, and then he turned himself towards Alistair and pointed his gun at him. There was nothing Alistair could do at this point, and Neil turned, shot him as well, and he fell to the floor. And then Neil made his way through to where he could hear someone else was present, and that was in the downstairs kitchen area. He made his way down and he found Johnny Green. Again, saying nothing, he turned and fired the gun at Johnny, and this killed him instantly. There was screaming coming from one of the bedrooms, and Neil made his way towards that scream, and upstairs he found Lorna McIntyre. He honed in on Lorna, raised his pistol, shot her point blank range, and she collapsed, dying instantly. Then Neil retreated and he turned back around, went downstairs to the first floor where he'd started the killings. And then he started to gather up any sort of combustible materials that he could. He got them all together and he placed them around himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a box of matches. He lit one of those matches, threw it on the materials around him, and it ignited. He managed to make another pile of materials near Linda's body, and he did the exact same thing, lighting that pile and subsequently lighting Linda's body on fire. He waited for the fire to catch and making sure that it was definitely alight and the flames were getting larger and larger, and then he took the pistol, turned it on himself, and pulled the trigger. Neil then slumped onto the floor and his body lay next to Linda's. But in the other room, what he didn't know was that one of the victims that he had shot was still alive. Alistair McIntyre, Lorna's husband, after he'd been shot and slumped onto the floor, he'd actually not been dead. He could hear the commotion of what was happening around him, but he had waited for that final shot. He didn't know who had been shot at this point, but he had managed to sort of pull himself upwards. He looked around and saw the devastation that was happening around him, the fire that was happening around him. He managed to pull himself out of the house and drag himself along the lawn at the front of the house. Now, because the Red Gables building was built so far back from the road, by this point, although the fire was big and the smoke was high, no one had actually noticed the fire yet, so no one had come to help. Gradually, little by little, he managed to pull himself towards the main road. If he could make it there, he might be able to get help and survive. His hands, arms and nails were covered in blood and soil from pulling himself, his heavy body, all the way along that lawn and onto the gravel road. As soon as he made it onto that road, he collapsed, and thankfully a passerby saw him just at that moment and rushed over to help. By this point, it was around 6 p.m. and a local man, a man called Will, had seen Alistair crawling towards him and then collapsing in front of him, and so he rushed over to try and help him. Will rushed over to him. Quote, "I ran over and took the man's pulse. It was very weak. He had blood all over his stomach and on his nose. I sent for blankets to keep him warm. He didn't say anything to me and then his pulse stopped." Then Will smelled fire and he looked around and saw the smoke billowing from Red Gables Hotel. He told the now gathering neighbours to go and call the emergency services and get them here as soon as possible. Flames were now shooting through the burning roof beams, and the fire services did arrive and they started to try and put the fire under control. A doctor had also now arrived, but as the doctor got there, unfortunately, Alistair had passed away by this point and there was nothing that could be done for him. Neil was still clutching his pistol. The bodies were all eventually removed and they were taken to the local mortuary where they were identified by one of the sons of the victims. The next morning, fire officers and forensic detectives started to try and investigate what had happened and try and put together a timeline of the events of that night. Of course, there were no surviving witnesses at this point. Now, thankfully, when Alistair had crawled out of the burning house and that passerby had seen him, he had managed to tell them that a man had come in and shot everyone. So they knew that this was the work of probably one person, but they still needed to do their investigations. Despite those investigations, though, the police were at a loss to try and figure out why Neil had done this. The only explanation they could come up with was ultimately that Neil had snapped, shooting the hotel owner, the hotel owner's daughter, her husband and the one and only guest staying at the hotel at that time. There, of course, has been a lot of speculation about what might have been the reasons that Neil took out this mass murder in North Wales. Neil was a proud ex-serviceman who had no job, no family, and no friends. He'd lost everything that was important to him, and at this particular time he was quite drunk. He'd been drinking all afternoon, as witnesses had told police. It's speculated that he might have gone back to the hotel to settle a score or even ask for his job back. But he had that pistol in his pocket, and at one point he decided to shoot Linda, and then for whatever reason decided he had to go on with shooting everyone else who was in Red Gables at that time. Neil, whose nickname was the Commander, was just that. He'd been the commander of 2 submarines, used to issuing orders and having them obeyed without question. He may have found it difficult to adapt to civilian life, where people disagree with you and don't always follow the orders that you give. Of course, it's possible that he was suffering from PTSD at this time from his experience in the Navy. Now, back in the 1970s, PTSD wasn't known about, or certainly wasn't as well known about as it is today. He'd seen active service and he'd been in a position of authority that ultimately required him to get men to sacrifice their own lives, and he had to take all of that to the grave with him. And there's another question as to why he set the fire at Red Gables. Perhaps when he realised what he'd done and facing the prospect of public humiliation and a life prison sentence, this proud man decided to destroy any evidence through his failed attempt at trying to burn that building down. After the murders, the fire damage to Red Gables was repaired and it was reopened by new owners. Ultimately though, the hotel never really got going again, and it lay derelict and was eventually vandalised, and although it was put up on sale for just under £400,000, it was sold for under half of that, around £150,000. The hotel was eventually demolished and the site was then made into an apartment block in an attempt to wipe the stain of the mass murders of Penmaenmawr from history. As for the commander, Neil Rutherford, he will forever be remembered as the worst mass murderer in North Wales history. This is Red Rum. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. If you're enjoying the content, I think we're getting episodes out once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week. Please take a look through the back catalogue of episodes. I think there's over 50 up there now. So I will link a couple at the end of this video if you want to go and check them out, or you can just click on the Red Rum YouTube channel and there'll be loads there to watch. Otherwise, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.